The delegate from Veth arrived 17 minutes late to his own press conference, and nobody who watched the recording afterward could agree on what his expression meant. He stood at the crystalline podium in the conclave's neutral zone station above the planet Marath, surrounded by journalists from 41 species, and he said nothing for almost a full minute. The feeds captured it all, his secondary eyelids cycling slowly, the bioluminescent filaments along his jaw flickering in an irregular pattern that Veth linguists would later classify as something between profound disorientation and the specific kind of dread that precedes understanding something you cannot unknow. He opened his mouth twice, closed it both times. Then he said, in flawless galactic common, Earth's representative has declined the summit. That was all. He stepped away from the podium without answering a single question. What the feeds didn't capture, because it happened in a private corridor 17 seconds before the conference began, was the conversation between High Delegate Oru Vane of the Veth Compact and his senior adjutant, a woman named Sela Marsh, who had been Earth's diplomatic liaison for the past 9 years, and who had handed him the declination personally, in a sealed envelope made of actual paper, which he held for the remainder of the day without being able to bring himself to open again. Inside the envelope was one sentence. Nobody outside that corridor knew what the sentence said. Not for a long time, but within 48 hours of the press conference, 3 things happened simultaneously in different parts of the galaxy that nobody would understand were connected until much later. And by the time anyone understood, the war that should have started that day had transformed into something the galaxy had no existing vocabulary to describe. The first thing, a Veth warship, the Unbroken Meridian, detected a human cargo hauler crossing the Sheth corridor, a transit lane that the Veth Compact had formally prohibited to all non-compact vessels 6 months prior, as one of the preliminary pressure maneuvers in the escalating standoff with Earth. The cargo hauler did not stop when hailed, did not change course, did not acknowledge the prohibition in any way. The Unbroken Meridian's captain ordered weapons armed and transmitted 3 formal warnings. The hauler continued, unhurried, at exactly the same speed it had been traveling before. When the warship pulled alongside and its crew looked through optical sensors at the hauler's cockpit, they saw the pilot, a human woman, apparently middle-aged, with close-cropped gray hair and a thermos of something hot, glance at the warship with complete calm, and then return her attention to whatever she was reading. She wasn't afraid. This is the detail that the Unbroken Meridian's captain would spend the next 3 months trying to explain to his superiors and failing. The second thing, on Marath Station itself in the medical bay, a human named Jonas Weil, part of Earth's small diplomatic support staff, a man who handled logistics and translation support, and who had never been in any file labeled important, collapsed during what the station's health systems classified as a routine elevated stress reaction. When the Veth medical technicians reached him, they discovered that he had been managing a condition for 11 months that, in any of their species, would have required immediate withdrawal from active duty. He had disclosed it to no one. He was awake again within 4 hours, refused transport back to Earth, and returned to his desk. The medical technicians filed a report. The report was read by a Veth intelligence analyst named Drevon Saul, who made a note that she considered unimportant, and then, 3 weeks later, while reviewing completely unrelated files, realized the note had been quietly consuming the back of her mind ever since. The third thing, Earth's central government released a public statement, not through any diplomatic channel, not in response to any formal accusation, but simply posted to their public information systems the way they might announce infrastructure updates. It was 2 paragraphs long. It thanked the Galactic Conclave for 9 years of partnership. It expressed regret that current pressures had made continued collaboration difficult. It said Earth would not be participating in the summit. It did not say what Earth would be doing instead. The absence of that information was what made Drevon Saul's unnamed dread begin to crystallize into something with edges. She had been studying humanity for 6 years. She had read everything the Compact's intelligence apparatus had gathered. She understood them better than most of her colleagues, which meant she understood them approximately the way a person who has read extensively about the ocean understands drowning. When you study humans long enough, you begin to develop a specific, recurring sensation, a sense that you are always one translation away from something important, that the gap between what they say and what they mean is not deception but something stranger, a layering of reasons that go deeper than the layer you have just found. You reach what you think is the bottom and discover it is a floor with a door in it. The sentence in the envelope that Oru Vane couldn't bring himself to read again was 8 words. We have already decided what we are willing to lose. For weeks after the summit collapse, the Veth Compact's Strategic Council operated on a specific assumption, that Earth was bluffing. This was a reasonable assumption. Earth was, by every measurable metric, the least militarized major civilization in the conclave. Their fleet was modest. Their defense infrastructure was designed around deterrence and response, not sustained offensive projection. They had no history of initiating conflict. They had, in fact, a deeply unusual history, unprecedented in the conclave's records, of absorbing significant political and economic damage over extended periods without retaliating, then abruptly resolving disputes through negotiation, as though the suffering had been purposeful, as though they had been waiting for something specific. The Strategic Council called this pattern passive escalation management and classified it as a form of weakness with good branding. Drevon Saul called it something she didn't have a word for yet, and she found that significantly more disturbing. The pressure campaign the Veth had deployed against Earth was methodical and calibrated. Transit restrictions, trade limitations, quiet pressure on conclave member worlds that traded heavily with Earth, minor territorial disputes elevated to formal protests. None of it was war. All of it was designed to demonstrate, slowly and undeniably, that Earth's position in galactic politics was contingent on Veth goodwill, and that this goodwill had conditions. The conditions involved Earth withdrawing support for a disputed territorial claim near the Cephali Drift, where a small group of human colonists had settled a region the Veth considered strategically valuable, not inhabited by Veth, not formally claimed by Veth under any treaty that Earth had signed, but desirable. And Earth had, for 3 years, declined to relocate the colonists. They had declined very quietly, in very polite language, with extensive documentation of why the settlers had legal standing, and they had continued declining, with slight variations in wording but identical meaning, through escalating pressure, for 3 years. The Veth Strategic Council had assumed that continued economic pain would eventually produce a different answer. They did not understand, yet, that Earth wasn't looking for a way to make the pain stop. They were letting the pain accumulate. Jonas Weil, back at his desk in Marath Station's diplomatic wing, was running 4 separate communication channels simultaneously when Drevon Saul knocked on his door. She was not supposed to be in this section. He looked at her with the same complete calm that seemed to be a human epidemic, poured her a cup of something from a battered container, and waited. "You didn't tell anyone," she said, not an accusation, more like she was checking the shape of something. He looked at her steadily. "Tell anyone what? Your condition." He was quiet for a moment. "Would it have changed anything? It would have changed your workload, your assignment." "Yes," he said, "that's why." She sat down because something about this conversation was making her legs feel uncertain. "You needed to be here. Things needed to be handled. Jonas." She used his first name without planning to. "You were in enough pain that our sensors classified it as a medical emergency. 11 months. 12, actually," he said. "I miscounted when I filed the initial disclosure." "You didn't file any disclosure." "Right." He took a slow breath. "I was going to when it settled down." She stared at him. He was, as far as she could determine, completely sincere. He hadn't been hiding his condition as an act of sacrifice. He hadn't been performing heroism. He had simply been managing it alongside his work the way one manages an inconvenient weather pattern, and he had genuinely expected things to settle down, and they hadn't, and he had continued. Drevon Saul went back to her quarters that night and reopened every file she had on human physiological thresholds, and found, for the first time, the data that she had previously categorized as measurement error. It wasn't measurement error. Human pain tolerance, not just physical but psychological, social, economic, institutional, had been consistently misregistered by conclave monitoring systems because those systems were calibrated on existing species data, and humans operated significantly above the expected curve. Not because they felt less. The neurological evidence was clear. They felt more, often. But the relationship between feeling pain and changing behavior was, in humans, dramatically less linear than in any other species the conclave had catalogued. They didn't stop because it hurt. Some of them seemed to continue specifically because it hurt, as though the pain were a form of confirmation rather than a deterrent. She forwarded the analysis to 3 of her superiors with a note she spent 40 minutes writing and then reduced to 1 sentence. I think we have fundamentally misread the nature of Earth's patience. None of the 3 responded. 2 weeks later, the cargo hauler pilot, her name was Petra Asanov, and she had been running that same transit lane for 6 years, well before the Veth prohibited it, was boarded. The Unbroken Meridian's crew spent 4 hours searching her vessel, found nothing that constituted a legal violation of any treaty Earth had signed, and were therefore unable to detain her. She accepted their presence on her ship with a hospitality that was apparently culturally standard for her, offered them food, which most of them declined, showed them her cargo manifests without being asked, and at one point fixed a minor seal malfunction in their scanning equipment because she happened to have the right tool. The boarding team filed a report that was technically about the interdiction and practically about the woman, because the boarding team could not stop thinking about the woman. Their commander, a Veth officer named Krethmal, wrote the following in his personal log. She knew we could destroy her ship. She knew it from the moment we pulled alongside. She knew it the whole time we were aboard. I don't know what to do with the fact that knowing it seemed to change nothing about how she was moving through her own vessel. He didn't submit that as an official report. He didn't know what category it fell under. It was around this time that the Veth Compact made the decision that changed everything. The colonists in the Cephali Drift had been a low-level irritant for 3 years. Earth's consistent refusal to relocate them had been interpreted as a political position, a line drawn for domestic reasons, for public optics, for negotiating leverage. The Compact's council believed, with the confidence of a civilization that had managed 19 territorial disputes in the last century, that every refusal has a price at which it becomes a concession. You simply have to find the price. They found what they believed was the price. The colony had approximately 412 residents, families, 3 generations of settlement. The Compact sent a formal notice of involuntary territorial enforcement, which was, in language the conclave had technically approved for such disputes, an eviction notice backed by a warship. The colonists were given 30 days to relocate. Earth's government was notified simultaneously. Earth's response arrived in 6 hours. Not through diplomatic channels, not as a formal protest. It was a message sent directly to the warship's commanding officer from the Office of Earth's Director of Planetary Affairs, and it said, "The residents of Cephali Drift have been informed of your notice. They have voted. They are not leaving. We support their decision." The commanding officer transmitted this to the Compact's council with his own note attached, which read, "Request clarification on authorization parameters." He was asking, very carefully, whether he was authorized to remove the colonists by force. The authorization came back in 4 days. It was technically a yes, framed in language that provided considerable flexibility in interpretation, which the commanding officer later said he had genuinely tried to use. What happened when the Compact's ground teams arrived on the colony is documented in their own after-action report, which was classified at the highest level within an hour of being filed, and which Drevon Saul accessed through channels she spent the rest of her career technically not admitting she had used. The colonists didn't fight. There were no weapons, no barricades, no organized resistance in any form the Compact's forces had prepared for. They were all outside, standing together in the colony's central common area in the cold of the drift's atmosphere, and they were just present, looking at the ground team, not threatening, not begging, not negotiating. Parents were holding children. The oldest resident, a woman who was apparently 93 years old by human reckoning, was sitting in a chair someone had carried out for her, and she was watching the compact's officers with an expression that the officer describing the scene in the report spent 600 words trying to characterize before writing. I cannot describe it except to say that it made me feel as though I were the one being assessed. They had clearly known this was coming. They were clearly not surprised. And they were clearly not going to move. The ground team withdrew. The commanding officer again requested clarification on parameters. The compact's council made the decision. The authorization that came back next had no flexible language. It was the moment the sentence in the envelope became historical fact. We have already decided what we are willing to lose. The news reached Earth's government and Earth's public at the same time, because there were communication systems in the colony and they were running until the last moment. And the last transmission from Cephali Drift was audio only, from a man named Danel Obi, who was the colony's appointed speaker, and who had spent 14 years building a farm on a planet in a disputed drift, and who said very quietly before the feed ended, "We're still here." And then the feed ended. The reaction on Earth was not what the Veth Compact had modeled. They had expected grief, outrage, political pressure that might ultimately produce exactly the withdrawal they had wanted. They had run these calculations very carefully. They had historical precedent across a dozen species. Tragedy produces political pressure produces capitulation. The math was sound. Something went wrong with the math. Earth did not mobilize its fleet. Earth did not issue a declaration of war. Earth did not make speeches. Earth's government released a statement that was 3 sentences long. The residents of Cephali Drift are gone. We know who is responsible. We will not forget. That was all. For 72 hours nothing happened. In the Compact's Strategic Council there was a moment, brief but real, of something that felt almost like relief. The pressure had been applied. Earth had absorbed it. The territory was cleared. The precedent was set. Then the Compact's Economic Monitoring Division filed a report that initially seemed unrelated. 17 trade contracts between Compact-affiliated corporations and Earth-based suppliers had been quietly terminated in the past month. Not publicly. No press releases. The corporations involved had simply been informed, through legal representatives, that Earth was unable to continue fulfilling the contracts. Regrettable but final. The termination payments had been made. Everything was technically clean. The timing meant the decisions had been made before Cephali Drift, before the eviction notice, almost simultaneously with Earth's refusal to participate in the summit. Drevon Saul read the report and felt the floor shift beneath her. They hadn't been waiting to see what happened. They had already decided. We have already decided what we are willing to lose. She began pulling every economic thread she could find. It took her 12 days, because she was one analyst working through massive amounts of deliberately unremarkable data. Nothing classified on Earth's end, nothing hidden, just quiet decisions distributed across thousands of separate commercial and governmental entities, each individually insignificant, collectively forming a pattern that made her feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Earth had been decoupling, not from the Compact specifically, from the architecture of dependency that the Compact had spent 9 years quietly building into Earth's economy. The transit restrictions had been intended to hurt. They had hurt, and Earth had responded by slowly, without announcement, over the course of 11 months, finding alternatives, building redundancies, accepting short-term losses in exchange for long-term independence, and doing all of this quietly enough that the Compact's monitoring had classified it as normal economic adjustment. The Compact hadn't been applying pressure to Earth. They had been watching Earth prepare. This was the moment Drevon Saul understood that she needed to explain something to the Council immediately, and also that the Council was not going to understand it, because the thing she needed to explain wasn't a tactic or a strategy or even a plan. It was a quality, and qualities are very hard to brief. Humans do not respond to pain by looking for the fastest way to make it stop. They respond to pain by asking how long they can manage it, and then they manage it slightly longer than that, because the estimate itself was conservative, because they always leave margin they don't tell anyone about. They had been running the 11-month calculation that Jonas Weil had been running in his own body, metabolically, institutionally, at a civilizational scale. They had been measuring not whether it would hurt but whether they could carry it. They had decided they could. Drevon Saul submitted a formal analysis to the Strategic Council. She called it, with the directness she had always preferred, on the nature of human endurance as a strategic variable that we have treated as a cultural footnote. The council discussed it in a session she was not invited to. The decision they made in that session was the final line. It came from a place that might have been genuine miscalculation, or might have been pride, or might have been the specific overconfidence of a civilization that had never encountered something it couldn't eventually outlast. The compact had resources Earth could not match, time Earth could not match. The Cephali colonists had been a test. The test had been passed. The next phase was simply more. Except that nobody on the council read the 7 words at the bottom of Drevon Saul's analysis, which she had placed there because she didn't know what else to do with them, because they were not strategic analysis, but they were what kept her awake. They are not trying to win. They are becoming something that can survive long after winning would have been possible. The compact's next action was surgical. A blockade on Earth's primary transit hub at the Kethrin Relay, not a military blockade in the treaty sense, but a regulatory maneuver, a series of inspection requirements and processing delays that would, in practice, slow Earth's interstellar commerce to approximately 40% of normal capacity. Legal, technically compliant, economically devastating. It took effect on a Tuesday. On Thursday, Earth's Foreign Ministry released a statement confirming awareness of the blockade. The statement noted that Earth's legal team was reviewing the compliance specifications and would respond through appropriate channels within 30 days. On Friday, Petra Asinov's cargo hauler came through the Kethrin Relay. 18 other human-flagged vessels followed her within the hour. None of them were running the inspection protocols. None of them stopped when hailed. All of them continued at normal transit speed with the same profound, catastrophic, unreasonable calm. The relay's administrative authority contacted the Compact's council with a message that was professionally worded, but had the specific texture of a communication written by someone who has just watched something happen that they cannot classify. Earth's vessels are in technical violation of the new protocols. However, we cannot find a treaty mechanism for the specific enforcement action this would require. We are asking for guidance. The guidance was 3 days coming, because the council was arguing about something that should have been simple and was instead somehow not simple at all. By the time guidance arrived, 47 human vessels had passed through Kethrin without compliance, each one unhurried, each one when the relay sent inspection personnel aboard, and eventually they did because something had to happen, received those personnel with the same unsettling hospitality. Food offered, questions answered, equipment occasionally repaired. Nothing that could be classified as confrontation, nothing that could be classified as threat, just presence, continued calm, deliberate presence. Kreth Mal, who had filed his personal log entry about Petra Asinov and never quite stopped thinking about it, requested a meeting with Drevon Saul through unofficial channels. She had never met him before. They sat in a transit station cafe and he said, without preamble, "They're not defying us." She looked at him. "They're not defying us," he said again. Defiance is a reaction. They're just continuing, like we're weather. "Yes," she said. "What does that mean?" She thought about Jonas Weil returning to his desk, Petra Asinov reading her book, the colonists standing in the cold, not moving, not threatening, simply being present and being themselves until they couldn't anymore. "I think," she said slowly, "that it means they've decided the cost of stopping is higher than the cost of continuing." "That's not rational," he said. "The cost of continuing will get higher, will make it higher." "I know, they know that." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And they're continuing anyway." "Yes." He said nothing for a long time, then, "Why?" She had thought about this for 6 years, and she had recently arrived at an answer that she suspected was correct and found deeply uncomfortable because it reframed everything she thought she understood about the standoff. Because, she said, they are not continuing towards something. They are continuing away from something. And the thing they are moving away from, the thing they are willing to accept any cost to avoid, is not military defeat. He waited. It's becoming the kind of civilization, she said quietly, that gave up. Krethmal went home that night and did not sleep, and in the morning he filed the personal log entry that he should have filed 2 months earlier about Petra Asanov, and attached to it everything he had understood from the conversation with Drevon Saul, and sent it to the Compact's Supreme Council marked urgent. They read it. She knew they read it because of what happened next. What happened next was the action that she had been hoping, in whatever part of her that still functioned as hope, they would not take. The Compact had identified, through months of intelligence work, the individuals within Earth's government who had been most central to the decoupling process. The quiet architects, the people who had made the decisions early enough that the decisions didn't look like decisions yet. 7 people across different departments and agencies, none of them prominent, all of them, in retrospect, having spent the last year building the infrastructure of Earth's independence. Among them was Jonas Weil. It was not violent. The Compact was precise in its methods. It was legal in the way that most harmful things are legal if you are large enough to write the language: travel restrictions, asset freezes under anti-competition frameworks. One by one, the 7 people who had built Earth's quiet resilience were removed from their positions through the regulatory architecture the Compact had spent years quietly constructing, made ineffective, sidelined. Drevon Saul found out through a secondary intelligence channel and sat in her quarters for a long time before she could move. She did not know what she had expected. She did not know what she had wanted. She knew that she had spent 6 years studying humans, and that the study had left her with something that was neither admiration nor fear but contained elements of both, a fundamental restructuring of her sense of what it meant to encounter another civilization's will, and she knew that what the Council had just done was not clever. It was not finding the price at which Earth's patience would break. It was something else. It was personal. And she did not yet know, nobody did, what humans became when it became personal. She found out the same way everyone did, when Earth's response arrived. Not a declaration of war, not a mobilization notice. Just a message, formal and correct in format, delivered to every member of the Galactic Conclave simultaneously, from the office of Earth's head of government, 7 words per sanctioned removal, with none of the diplomatic insulation that usually padded such communications. You have shown us what this costs. We have decided we would rather pay it than stop. We are done negotiating the terms of our own diminishment. What comes next is not retaliation. It is the end of our patience with your management of the word patience. And then Earth did something that the Conclave, the Compact, every civilization that had been watching this standoff with the comfortable distance of uninvolved parties had not modeled. They released the analysis, all of it, every piece of intelligence they had gathered, not on the Compact's military positions or fleet capabilities, which would have been normal, but on the Compact's economic architecture, the dependency chains. The places where the Compact's own trading partners were quietly locked into arrangements that were less partnership and more orbit. The documentation was extraordinary. It had clearly been compiled over years. It was not angry. It was not threatening. It was simply complete. And it was addressed to every civilization the Compact traded with. Within a week, 5 of those civilizations had requested emergency diplomatic consultations, not with Earth, but with the Compact. Not in response to the documentation specifically, but because the documentation had made visible something that, once visible, could not be unseen. The Compact wasn't the only one who had been managing other civilizations' patience. They had just been the most advanced at it. And the thing about advancing at something without anyone understanding how advanced you've become, the thing Earth had just demonstrated, is that once someone explains the mechanism, it looks different to everyone involved. Drevon Saul was in the council chamber when the reports started arriving. She watched the council members' faces as they processed each new message. Confusion. Then something shifting beneath the confusion, a reorientation happening faster than she'd ever seen in a formal chamber. Then, very quietly, on the face of the Supreme Coordinator, an expression she had never seen on any Veth face before and could not name. She named it later privately in her notes, the specific quality of fear that belongs to someone who has just realized that the opponent has not been reacting to the game, but has been deciding when to reveal they were playing a different one. The colonists of Cephali Drift were gone. That was real. That was permanent. The weight of that had been in Earth's message without being in its words, because Earth had not mentioned them, had not used them as justification or ammunition or moral leverage, and the absence of their names was somehow more devastating than their presence would have been. As though Earth's government was saying, "We know what was done. We are not using it. We are carrying it. And we are continuing anyway." Kreth Mal resigned his commission 3 days after the analysis was released. He sent Drevon Saul a message that said only, "I think I understand what she was reading now." She didn't know what he meant until she found the file that had been quietly added to the Open Intelligence release, a small document not important in the geopolitical context, just a personal record, a log entry from a cargo hauler's flight computer. Petra Asanov had been reading the colony's communication archives. 14 years of ordinary messages, births, arguments, harvest records, children's drawings transmitted to grandparents on other worlds. She had been reading them every time she made that transit run for the past 8 months. The Compact's boarding team had seen her reading something, had looked at the screen during their inspection, and had classified the content as personal correspondence, irrelevant. She had been reading the proof that the place was real, the people were real, and that they deserved someone to cross a prohibited line for them while they were still there to benefit from it. She had done this knowing, with mathematical certainty, that one of those transits might be her last. Drevon Saul sat with that for a long time. She thought about the 8 words. She thought about Jonas Weil returning to his desk in the morning, every morning, in a body that was measuring out its cooperation in smaller and smaller increments, and doing it anyway. She thought about the colonists standing in the cold with their faces open and their children near, and the old woman sitting in her carried chair, watching the Compact's officers with an expression that had made a trained military officer feel assessed. She thought about what Earth had not done for 3 years under sustained economic pressure, had not surrendered, had not escalated, had not made dramatic statements or built toward dramatic confrontations, had simply continued quietly, systematically, building the architecture of a civilization that could absorb whatever was done to it and emerge still itself. And she thought about what they had just done, not with weapons, not with force, with documentation. With the patient accumulation of truth over years, deployed at the precise moment when it would produce maximum structural consequence. The thing she had not understood, the thing she suspected no civilization had understood, was not that humans were stubborn. It was that their stubbornness was not passive. It was the most active thing she had ever encountered. Every day they continued was a decision remade. Every transit through a prohibited corridor was a choice repeated. Every morning Jonas Weil returned to his desk was not habit. It was will. It was a civilization that did not maintain its values because of momentum but because of daily recommitment, every individual separately and simultaneously deciding, this is who we are, and this is worth the cost, and the cost does not change what it's worth. The Galactic Conclave in the weeks that followed restructured 3 major trade frameworks. The Compact's influence narrowed. The regulatory mechanisms they had used against Earth were examined, documented, and several were formally invalidated. None of this undid Cephali Drift. Nothing could undo Cephali Drift. Earth had said they would not forget, and they would not, and the galaxy had seen what it looked like when humans remembered. Drevon Saul was appointed to a newly formed commission studying human civilization's role in conclave stability. She accepted. She was the most qualified person for the role, and she was exhausted, and she accepted anyway because she could not stop. because she had spent 6 years embedded in the question of what humanity was, and she had not finished yet. In her first report to the Commission, she wrote one paragraph that was later reproduced, without her permission, though she didn't pursue it in academic papers, diplomatic briefings, and eventually in the recorded oral traditions of 6 species who had been watching from the galactic periphery. What the Compact failed to understand, and what every civilization engaging with Earth must eventually reckon with, is that humans do not experience endurance the way we do. We endure by becoming less, we conserve, we reduce, we protect what remains. Humans endure by becoming more specifically themselves. The pressure we applied did not deplete them. It clarified them. Every threshold we pushed them past, they arrived at the other side knowing more precisely who they were and what they would not give up. We were trying to wear down a species that has spent its entire recorded history learning how to carry more than it thought it could. We looked at their patience and saw weakness. We were watching a civilization decide how much it loved itself. The last file she added to the Commission's archive was a copy of Kreth Mal's personal log entry, the one he had been afraid to file, and beneath it a small addendum of her own. Petra Asanov still runs the transit lane. The new regulatory framework means it's legal now. She is still reading. The Conclave asked Earth formally whether it had plans to pursue further action against the Compact. Earth's response was returned within a day. It was polite. It was thorough. It was 3 pages of careful diplomatic language that left the reader somehow with the impression that the question had been deeply irrelevant, what no representative of any other species had been able to articulate, but which every diplomat, every intelligence analyst, every military officer who had spent time in proximity to humans had felt like a change in atmospheric pressure, was this: Earth didn't need to pursue anything. Earth had simply refused to stop being itself for long enough at sufficient cost, until the galaxy had no choice but to reshape around that refusal. They had not won by being stronger. They had not won by being smarter. They had won, if winning was even the right word for something that had cost them everything they'd lost, by being so completely and irrevocably committed to remaining themselves that the alternative had become structurally impossible. The Cephali colonists had names. All 412 of them. Earth made sure the Conclave knew everyone, not in a speech, not in a formal chamber. They were added quietly to the official registry of the Kethrin Relay, the transit point where 53 human vessels had passed through without compliance, while the galaxy tried to decide what to do about a species that simply continued. The names were in the registry's memorial section, a function that had existed for navigational accidents and had never been used for anything like this. Every vessel passing through Kethrin would see them now, every species, every captain, including, eventually, the Unbroken Meridian's replacement command crew, who, by all accounts, read the names very carefully, and then, after a long silence, continued on their way. The way you continue when you have understood something about what it costs to cross certain people. The way you continue when you are grateful, quietly and completely, that they are not, at this moment, continuing toward you.